Reflexive verbs in Spanish are verbs that are applied to oneself, which is typically the definition that most teachers give them. However, I do not like this explanation because I have a different way of expressing reflexive verbs in Spanish, making it easier to understand what they mean. A different way to look at reflexive verbs in Spanish is that they typically follow a preposition or some continuation. The way that they look in Spanish is by having any regular verb following the continuation se after, which is a form of an indirect object pronoun that has to do with oneself. I will not explain every reflexive verb in Spanish because you don't need all of them, but I will present the most useful ones in Spanish. At first, I would like to demonstrate how reflexive verbs work in general by showing how one verb works first. Let's take the verb lavar as an example. This verb in Spanish means to wash, but in Spanish, the verb to wash doesn't always conclude in its regular form. Oftentimes, when we think of washing something, we can sometimes say to wash up. If you look at the verb in Spanish and compare it to English, there isn't really much of a difference, but once this verb becomes reflexive, we start to see that the meaning is changing. Lavar means to wash, but lavarse means to wash up, which is a verb that's put in a reflexive form, and that's really the closest connection I can give it in English. The way that you would use the verb in Spanish is by using indirect object pronouns and putting them before the conjugated verb. For instance, saying yo lavo means I wash, as in I wash something that's unrelated to oneself, as in yo lavo el coche, I wash the car. However, if I were to say me lavo, this is where the meaning itself changes because the verb is not wash, but rather wash up, meaning I wash up something that has to do with oneself. For instance, saying yo lavo el coche means I wash the car, but saying me lavo mis manos means I wash up my hands. In Spanish, the verb to wash can change its meaning depending on how the action is used, with lavar meaning to wash and with lavarse meaning to wash up, and with the verb getting a preposition when it's logically translated into English. In simpler words, reflexive verbs in Spanish, like these, are verbs that follow a preposition or some continuation when they're put into English. And as I said in the beginning, that's the closest connection I can give it in English, with every verb having its own unique definition. If you think it's a difficult concept in Spanish, you'd be surprised to know that in English, there are many verbs that follow prepositions, and not only are they different, their meaning changes indefinitely. In English, you can have the verb to give, but when you start adding prepositions to it, the meaning changes through all verbs. To give off, to give up, and to give in are verbs that change their meaning once they're put into context, and that's only one verb to use. Not to mention that it's a concept many people who learn English struggle with. In Spanish, however, this concept is easier to understand because the difference between a regular verb and a reflexive verb in Spanish is the word se in the verb itself, which can indicate that it's a verb that has a preposition after it in English. Lavar means to wash, but lavarse means to wash up, which logically works in Spanish, but in English, it may cause a bit of confusion. We can also say I wash up the car or I wash my hands, and while that's normal in English, Spanish doesn't allow this idea to work, which is why it generates different meanings with every verb. Reflexive verbs can also work in the present progressive, like saying tú estás lavando, meaning you are washing, and te estás lavando, meaning you are washing up. In the present progressive, you can also attach the indirect object pronoun to the end of the infinitive itself, like saying estás lavándote. But for Spanish speakers, it would be too strange to say, which is why most of the time, the indirect object pronoun has to be put before a conjugated verb. It's the same thing as saying in English, you are washing to you, which doesn't make sense, so overall, just remember to put indirect object pronouns before conjugated verbs. At last, reflexive verbs can also function in the past simple tense, like saying él lavó, meaning he washed, but saying a él se lavó means he washed up. And we know that it's a he because the construction a él indicates that. And that's really how reflexive verbs work in Spanish, and I would even say that they're not as hard as people think they are. For the sake of learning, I'd like to give all of you useful reflexive verbs so that you can understand how these verbs work at best. Because I'm not going to list every verb that exists in Spanish, some of the most useful ones in Spanish are bañarse, levantarse, despertarse, dormirse, irse, ponerse, sentarse, and llamarse. Bañar means to bathe, but bañarse means to take a bath. Saying a sentence like yo baño means I bathe, but saying me baño means I take a bath. Of course, you can stretch the sentence in any way you want, whether it's using a different object pronoun, putting it in the present progressive, or past simple tense. Levantarse is a verb that's easier to understand because levantar means to lift or to raise, but levantarse means to lift up or get up. Tu levantaste means you lifted, but te levantaste means you got up. Of course, you can stretch the sentence in any way you want. Despertar means to arouse or to awake, but despertarse means to wake up. Él despertó means he aroused, but a él se despertó means he woke up. Dormir means to sleep, but dormirse means to fall asleep. I really hope that you're starting to get the hang of it now, because most of these reflexive verbs are verbs that are used in the past simple tense. Of course, you can make any sentence you want using dormirse. Irse is a very interesting one because ir means to go, but irse means to go away or to leave. Saying yo voy means I go, but saying me voy means I go away or I leave. And the same concept applies to any pronoun and sentence you want to use. Poner means to put, but ponerse means to put down. But let's not forget that it's an irregular yo verb. Yo pongo means I put, but me pongo means I put down. And the same concept applies to any pronoun and sentence you want to use. Sentarse is actually a reflexive verb that's also stem changing. Sentar means to sit, but sentarse means to sit down. Yo siento means I sit, but me siento means I sit down. And the last most useful reflexive verb is actually a verb that many beginners heard of but never understood, and that is llamarse. While llamar means to call, as in to call someone by phone, llamarse means to call oneself, or yourself in this case, because it's a verb that has to do with oneself. The most used sentence that everyone has heard of is ¿Cómo te llamas?, meaning how do you call yourself. While ¿Cómo llamas?, can mean how do you call, as in how do you call your favorite person or whatever, ¿Cómo te llamas?, means how do you call yourself, which is a fancy way of saying what's your name. You can reply by saying me llamo Alex or whatever your name is. A lot of beginners would tend to say something like me llamo es Alex or yo llamo Alex. And when you put these sentences in English, you'll get I call myself as Alex or I call Alex. And these are incorrect responses to the question ¿Cómo te llamas? And now you hopefully understand what this phrase finally means, along with how reflexive verbs work in Spanish. This has been Reflexive Verbs in Spanish. Thank you for watching this video, and hopefully I made your learning just a bit simpler.